Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on servant leadership, which is our leadership theory for module number 4. We will be using Robert Greenleaf's work, which hopefully you have had a chance to read the article. If not, that's okay. The lecture and the article go hand in hand no matter the order. So without further ado, let's get started. Just a quick little quote. Now, this quote just grabs me when I read servant as leader. And so Greenleaf writes that as I ponder the fusing of servant and leader, it seems a dangerous creation, dangerous for the servant, dangerous for the natural servant to become a leader, dangerous for the leader to be a servant first, and dangerous for a follower to insist on being led by a servant. There are safer and easier alternatives available to all three. And the reason I really like this quote, there's two reasons actually, and the first one is because I really think that servant leadership turns all other leadership theories or leadership theories prior to servant leadership kind of on its head. It kind of breaks down and disregards the traditional hierarchy of what leadership looks like in, say, an organizational chart or a top-bottom type organization. The other thing, too, is that I think there's a misconception that servant leadership or servant leaders are soft and passive, and I don't think that's really it at all. I think that being a servant first for many people is not inherently what we want to do, and it takes effort, and with that effort comes a lot of tension. And so servant leadership, creating that tension, I think really yields significant production for the individual being the servant leader and for the followers being served. So a brief history, back at 600 BC, you're going to see some themes. A lot of people have been doing this, and finally it's catching on with Greenleaf's work. But 600 BC, the greatest leader forgets himself and attends to the development of others. And then 375 BC, the leader shall consider as good not what pleases himself, but what pleases his subjects. And then oftentimes in leadership classes, especially when you're talking about leadership and ethics, and when you're talking about servant leadership, there are going to be discussions on the Bible and Jesus' life that come up. And so worth mentioning here, 1st century AD, a couple of quotes from the Bible, but the greatest among you shall be your servant. The one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. And then finally, the work that we're going to be talking about is 1970s Robert Greenleaf, who we'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. But Robert just says, the servant leader is servant first. It begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve first. So what is the definition of servant leadership? If we were in a class together in a classroom, I would probably have you guys jot down a few definitions in your own words of who is a servant, what is service, who is a leader, what is leadership, and then just take a moment to kind of reflect on that and see any similarities, differences, any parallels, juxtapositions in those word choices and kind of how you define those things. But Greenleaf says that the servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from the one who is leader first. So servant leader, servant first. It's kind of like student athlete, student first, right? Where is the priority? What's being emphasized in the definition of a person? So Greenleaf is considered to be the father of modern servant leadership. He worked for almost 40 years at AT&T, primarily in the management training and development department, and then after that spent about 25 years consulting on servant leadership. He is responsible for coining the term servant leader, and now has the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership, which I'd encourage you to Google if this leadership theory interests you. You can learn a lot more from their website. So, as you could tell from the article, he was inspired by this mythical journey by a group of people on a spiritual quest. He believes that true leadership stems first from a desire to serve, and that leadership is secondary. So for this presentation, I really just want to streamline the article because obviously it was pretty lengthy, it had a lot of good stuff in it, and so Larry Spears, the CEO of the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership, he's narrowed it down. Some people say 10 attributes, some people say 12. For this presentation, we're going to go with 10. And so I'm just going to kind of go through and touch upon each of these pretty quickly just to kind of give you an idea. Obviously, they were all in the article, but just to really kind of bullet point these 10 attributes of servant leadership. So listening, the servant leader seeks to listen receptively to not just what's being said, but also to what's being done. So a great emphasis on observation. Also, it promotes the servant leader to get in touch with his or her own inner voice and seeking to understand what is being communicated. So, the old saying is that we have one mouth and two ears, and so we should always be listening more than we're talking. That would definitely be a quote or characteristic of a servant leader. Empathy, that people need to be accepted and recognized for their special and unique spirit. So, servant leaders recognize individualization and individuality. They're also very good at identifying intentions and prioritizing intentions over the actual behavior. Being someone that works with children on a daily basis, this is very, 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 very important skill and very, 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 very hard to execute sometimes. Healing. So one of the great strengths of servant leadership is the potential for healings oneself and others. Servant leaders have this search for wholeness. They want to make sure that people learn how to heal, that healing is a powerful force for transformation and integration. Awareness. Servant leaders have a strong sense of what is going on around them. And honestly, in every leadership theory we talk about, awareness and self-awareness is going to be in there at some point. And so here it is. We mentioned before with listening that they are observers of self and others, and it's a constant evaluation that never really ends when it comes to awareness. Persuasion is number 5, and servant leaders rely on persuasion rather than positional authority in making decisions. And, the thing I think about when it comes to this is a coach. And so thinking about a coach, the coaches that I've been around, they don't rely on being the head coach or being the assistant coach to get players to do what they want, because that's usually just not going to work. Rather, they try to understand and get to know the player and understand the motivation, what motivates the player, and then use those motives to persuade the player to get to where he or she needs to be. So I think persuasion is a giant one when it comes to coaching. Very helpful when trying to get people on the same page, knowing what makes people tick. Conceptualization, and this is definitely one that I've experienced in becoming a leader of an organization, is you're responsible for a vision and you're also responsible for the day-to-day. So conceptualization means that the leader must think beyond day-to-day realities. Servant leaders must seek a delicate balance between conceptualization and day-to-day focus. So it's kind of this tasks versus vision balance that a leader has to find. And foresight is really just the ability to connect the dots. What has happened, what is happening now, what's going to happen in the future, what's the overlap between those three, and then kind of having that intuition to learn from your past and apply it to the future. Stewardship, I don't think it's a surprise that this is one of the attributes, but when we describe a leader as having a strong sense of stewardship, we refer to a desire to prepare the organization to contribute to the greater good of society. Not unlike preparing an intern to serve the greater good of an organization. Growth would be the next to last one, sorry. And, does your team or do your players believe that you're committed to helping them develop and grow? That's kind of the simple question to ask yourself on this one. Servant leaders work hard to help employees develop in a number of ways. Help teams and players help in a number of ways. Servant leaders need to connect to others' developmental needs and actively find ways to help them reach their true potential. And this is something that we do at Girls Place a lot. We're a small organization, but we carve out time every week to work on professional and personal development. And we spend at least an hour on it every week. And that's something that we feel we can do for our young staff, because a lot of our staff members are college students. And so really just trying to help and prepare them for the workplace personally and professionally. And then the last one, building community. Servant leaders have a strong sense of community spirit and work hard to foster an organization. They believe the organization needs to function as a community and work hard to build community within. Definitely applicable to teams, and we're going to get to that on this next slide. So, why are we talking about this with coaching? And also, why are we talking about this in the module that we're also talking about director of basketball operations? hopefully after you listen to a few of the lectures. The role of DOBO, and Director of Basketball Operations, so to say, that's the abbreviation, is very much a servant role. Your name's not going to be in the paper. You might not have a seat on the bench. You are not going to be an assistant coach who gets any credit for recruiting any players. You are definitely behind the scenes part of the team, but you're still very much part of the team, and you really kind of make the team go. And you guys can read this quote here that I thought was pretty good, and the image really kind of sums it up. As a servant leader, where are you? Are you sitting up on your desk watching everybody work, or are you down there helping pull your weight and right there in the trenches? And so, I've been doing some consulting work, and my biggest client is UNC Asheville. I did 5 workshops with their head coaches and athletic director last year, and their baseball coach, Scott Friedholm, he shared his coaching philosophy, and it just is one of those things that has stuck with me. And he explains his coaching philosophy is called the sweeping the shed mentality. And what that means is everyone has to be okay with doing everything and anything. The best player has to be okay with going to get the broom and sweeping out the shed. The head coach has to be okay with getting on the four-wheeler and dragging the field. The senior has to be okay with carrying the equipment of the freshman. So sweep the shed. If you have to be able to sweep the shed. If you're not willing to sweep the shed, then for him, you're not someone he wants on his team. But I would also say that sweep the shed is very much a servant leadership mentality. It is, I'm willing to do anything. I'm willing to put the needs of others before mine. I am not too good to do something. So, some servant leader examples, and first, before we get into these examples, we, pointing out a couple strengths. I think the strength of servant leadership is the leader becomes one with the followers. I think also that the servant leader transforms others in their lives. And there's very much this long-term mentality. Like, I think it could be argued that servant leadership isn't just leadership style, it's a way of life. It's definitely how you live your life. And that followers feel supported on the same playing field. And so you definitely build a community of equality, for sure. Weaknesses is that, servant leadership just doesn't happen overnight. Like I said earlier, I think it kind of turns leadership on its head. So it definitely takes a while for people to get used to and to get systems going the way you want them going. So it's definitely not an overnight fix to an organization or a team's problem. It definitely takes time. Oftentimes it's perceived as soft. You're looking at the screen up there and you see Gandhi and Mother Teresa. Not exactly Rambo coming at you up there, So can be perceived as soft and maybe even a little passive, but it's definitely not. I think it requires a lot more of us. Also, perception of that they just listen and there's no action. That would also be a weakness. So, here are a few examples. I think Gandhi and Mother Teresa, not really surprising anybody there on how they lived their life. We know a lot of their famous quotes. We know what they stood for. And actually, last night, I was able to go to Pat Summitt's memorial service in Knoxville. And so she might be a little bit of a surprise, because I think when people think of Pat Summitt, they think of aggressive, they think of loud, they think of her staring, icy glare, but the biggest message that came out of her memorial last night was that she put others first. Nothing was ever really about Pat. It was about her players, which there were 161 players that she's coached, and I would say, based on who was there, that there were at least over 100 who were able to make the memorial. And I think that speaks volumes to her. The example that she gave, or that one of her assistants, actually her former point guard, gave, was that when she was playing for Pat, that she was having a pity party for herself as the point guard. And Pat came over to her and said, you're an extension of me on the court, which means you don't get to feel sorry for yourself, because pity parties are just an extension of selfishness, because you're just spending time thinking about you. And right now, this isn't about you. This is about your teammates and putting them first. So I need you to get over yourself and put the needs of others and your teammates before you, because that's the only way we're going to be effective. And, kind of unexpected little story coming from that, but I thought it was really good, and I thought it was directly related to the concept of servant leadership. Is that as a point guard, you cannot be effective, you cannot be a leader with your team if you're not putting them first. And I think about it when I think about what kind of passes do they like? Do they like to run the lane in transition? What kind of screens do they like? And getting to know all those things. So as a point guard, it's not really about you. In order to be effective, it's about your teammates. And then lastly, my favorite servant leader example is Dory. And no, I am not just using that because the movie just came out. That's who I use in all my talks on servant leadership. But you think back to Finding Nemo and how their journey went and how they got where they were going. And Dory definitely was not the take charge kind of person. She barely knew what was going on most of the time, but she served Nemo's dad the entire way and never abandoned him. And they ultimately got to where they were going. So she is my servant leader example. I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with in your homework assignment. So just in closing, this is a pretty famous quote by Truman. You can accomplish anything in life, provided that you do not mind who gets the credit. And I think that summarizes what we've talked about today with servant leadership. Is at the end, what do you want it to be about? Do you want it to be about you? Do you want your name somewhere? Or do you want it to be about the job that you're getting done and the success of the team and the promotion of others? So look forward to hearing y'all's discussion. Look forward to hearing your homework, reading your homework assignments. And I hope you've enjoyed a brief chat and overview of servant leadership.